ORAF, as I've tried to illustrate in this example, is a very powerful catalyst for people to get in research. As you know, orthopedics is a very lucrative field, and it's very tempting for people to go into practice and reap the rewards of a good, healthy practice. But I think for some, the attraction of doing research is even greater. And ORAF provides a door through which people can go to try their hand at academics and at research. And I think ORAF is doing a tremendous job. And I think one of the things that's interesting about the ORAF grant process is that ORAF provides feedback to the investigator to try to help her or him do a better job of the research, do it better.
One of our senior investigators, Del Bosky, with a PhD studying bone, encouraged me to apply for a ORAF grant. I always thought as a veterinarian it really wasn't my purview. I was really content in looking at the basic science research that was funded internally. But she really stimulated me, said, take the big step and see if you can participate in this peer review grant process. And I took the big leap. And it was, the idea was funded, or basically was founded on a comment that Russ Warren, who at the time was the head of sports medicine, made to me that he was removing a meniscus in a young man. And he knew that it was not going to do well down the line. And he was always saying, well, I wish I could put something back in there. And I had remembered hearing a lecture by the late Henry Mencken from Mass General, who had, in the 70s was actually transplanting cryopreserved osteochondral knee grafts. And he saw that, those grafts eventually failed. He noted that the meniscus looked surprisingly well, even 5 years down the line. And that gave us the idea that perhaps we can actually transplant menisci. And so we went forward with the idea of proposing a project that would look at the ability of a cryopreserved meniscus allograft to heal itself in the knee, and most importantly, transmit the load equitably to minimize or perhaps completely prohibit any degenerative changes following initial meniscectomy. And that was the genesis of the grant. Fortunately, we were able to receive that grant, did the research, and published 3 peer-reviewed papers based on that research. And it was the forebearer for the clinical application of meniscal allografts in human orthopedic surgery.
Well, one of the grants that I applied for from the ORAF was an education grant. And it wasn't a research grant, and it was a grant to fund education on a continual basis for the residents in training in pathology of musculoskeletal neoplasms and injury and post-traumatic injuries, that kind of thing. I can remember when I wrote the application, I got a question back about, what do you want the money for education for? And my comment was, I thought it was the Orthopedic Research and Education Foundation. And they agreed immediately to fund it at that point in time.
A personal bias that clinician investigators are vital to moving clinical practice forward. I think we have wonderful basic scientists, and I have immense respect for them, but it's clinician investigators that understand what the clinical problem is. And for me, the focus was, when I was doing a lot of sports medicine, seeing all these young people suffering joint injuries and having disabling osteoarthritis very early on. And I said that is a clinical problem that we really need to try to solve. And I think clinicians bring a perspective that is absolutely essential to moving practice forward. So OREF, by funding young clinician investigators, can make a huge difference.
Well, ultimately, further into my career, I became vice chair for research. So Jim and I developed a long, really productive career, but he, in order to think orthopedic, he started to tell me about orthopedic problems and problems that needed solutions that did not at that time exist. And he said, I really think you need to apply for an OREF grant because this will force you to really make that transition. And it did. It made me reconsider what I was doing. We had a club. We listened to the residents. Every week I went to grand rounds. I began to restructure my thinking from the pure biologist that I was into a biologist that thought about how do you take basic information and turn it into products that people can really use. So from my point of view, that OREF grant was fundamental in my thinking. It was fundamental in how I changed the organization of our research team. We went from having no extramural dollars other than the grants that I brought in to being the 5th best funded department of orthopedics in the country. And we did this by really structuring our research portfolio from very basic research in how vitamin D regulates cartilage cells to now starting to look at how bone growth happens. How can you regulate bone growth? How do you treat a situation where bone growth has failed, like in a non-union? And Jim and I started to patent things.
You can't really go to the NIH. You don't have a portfolio to share with them. So you need seed money. Seed money is critical. And if you're successful using that seed money, then you can go to the NIH and apply for funding. And that's just what happened. The REF was seed money to get us going, and it led to some important observations. And then we shared that with the NIH. And that led to further funding. The advice I received again from George Galante, I mentioned his name a lot, was to collaborate. Some young investigators might have the ability to be a surgeon and a bench researcher, but that's very difficult. It was way beyond my capability. So what I did at George's suggestion was to collaborate. Find a scientist that you can work with who is a bench researcher and provide clinical relevance to their work, which was really my role, was to provide that clinical relevance. So my recommendation is find someone you can work with who has the time and the skill set to do bench research.